Hello, my name is Malcolm McCallum. Today I'll introduce the notice 91 FR 47193-47211, Federal Register Docket 2026-15204, published on July 28th of 2026. This is referred to as the Smalltail Shark Endangered Species Act 12-month finding. The Federal Register is an official daily publication of the United States federal government. It is where the federal agencies and president formally publish rules, proposed rules, notices, presidential documents, such as executive orders and proclamations. I'm Malcolm McCallum. I hold a PhD in environmental sciences and have over 30 years experience teaching higher education. As an environmental scientist, my role is to research, educate, and inform about how the world of humans and the world of nature interact. The umbrella of this is called the socio-ecological world. The overarching purpose of environmental sciences is to protect the everyday people and the natural world from the rich and powerful. So I believe just by explaining what news items appear in the Federal Register, I'll be informing everyday people what the government is really doing, if they are working for you or someone else. Remember to hit the like button or subscribe if you want to keep in the loop with what they want hidden by distraction campaigns or on TV or radio. Okay, for a brief summary of this finding. I guess I should. First, I'll tell you the title of this document is Endangered and Threatened Wildlife and Plants, 12-month finding on the petition to list the small-tailed shark as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. This was posted by the National Marine Fisheries Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, and the Department of Commerce. This is a notice of 12-month finding and availability of status review. The result of this document is that the National Marine Fisheries Service determined that the listing of the small-tailed shark as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act is not warranted. The contact person for the person who will receive comments for this decision is Dr. Nick Farmer, and the National Marine Fisheries Service Southeast Regional Office. His phone number is 727-228-3855, and his email address is nick.farmer@noaa.gov. And you can look this up online by just inserting the title into Google or the number, and you'll be able to read the entire notice yourself. But in summary, this Federal Register notice is a final 12-month ESA petition finding not a proposed listing rule. The National Marine Fisheries Service reviewed the Center for Biological Diversity's petition to list the small-tailed shark as threatened and endangered and concluded that listing is not warranted. The agency also declined to move forward with similar in-appearance treatment for sharpnose sharks because the small-tailed shark itself was not listed. The small-tailed shark is a small coastal shark in the western Atlantic with a range extending from the northern Gulf of Mexico, they say the Gulf of America, but I'll stay geographically correct rather than politically, to Brazil and northern South America. The National Marine Fisheries Service describes it as a light brown or gray dorsally and dirty white ventrally, with a maximum total length of 150 centimeters. The species can be confused with the sharp-nosed sharks, which matters because misidentification complicates fishery data and enforcement. The most important factual issue is the uncertainty. The National Marine Fisheries Service acknowledges evidence of substantial decline in Brazil, continued bycatch and illegal harvest, and inadequate enforcement in the core range. Yet the agency concluded that the record does not show the shark is presently in danger of extinction or likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future across all or a significant portion of its range. Thus, the practical result is that the ESA listing of no ESA critical habitat and no ESA Section 7 or Section 9 protections for the species. Understand those are the declarations of the agency. They are not necessarily scientifically valid. They are what the policymakers have decided. How the notice changes the species regulatory posture from candidate status review stage to a completed not warranted finding. That means it does not receive any protections where before as a candidate it did. In May of 2023, the National Marine Fisheries Service issued a positive 90-day finding, meaning that the petition presented substantial information that listing may be warranted and that the National Marine Fisheries Service would conduct a status review. The July 2026 action closes that review with the opposite result. The agency determined the best available data do not justify ESA listing. The legal consequence is substantial. If the National Marine Fisheries Service had listed the smalltail shark as endangered or threatened, federal agencies would have had to consult under ESA Section 7 for action that may affect the species. Take prohibitions and protective regulations could have applied. Critical habitat could have been considered, and import, export, and interstate commerce controls could have been changed. Because the finding is not warranted, none of those new ESA mechanisms are triggered by this notice. The notice also reflects a broader post-harm conservation law context, and if you'd like to know more about that, go back a while back. I had a review of the changes in the Endangered Species Act treatment of critical habitat and indirect killing of the species. That was posted a few weeks ago. Still the same policy pattern is visible. The agency is placing heavy weight on uncertainty and regulatory sufficiency, leaving the species dependent on existing domestic, international, and foreign fisheries controls rather than adding ESA protections. The decision is especially important because the species' core distribution is outside U.S. waters, particularly in Brazil and northern South America. The U.S. Endangered Species Act listing can still matter for foreign species through import-export trade, federal action, and international conservation signaling, but it is not the same as direct domestic habitat management. The National Marines... Sorry, I had a phone call, and I don't want to have to re-record all this, so we'll just start where we left off. So the decision is especially important because the species' core distribution... Oh, I already talked about that. So what is the rationale of the National Marine Fisheries Service on this issue? The National Marine Fisheries Service grounds the decision in the Endangered Species Act's requirement that listing determinations be made solely on the best scientific and the commercial data available. The agency convened a 6-member status review team with expertise in shark life history, fishery biology, population dynamics, fisheries management, and protected species conservation. The status review report was externally peer-reviewed by 3 independent experts, and the National Marine Fisheries Service states that the peer review comments were addressed before publication. The strongest rationale for not listing is evidentiary insufficiency. The National Marine Fisheries Service agrees that smalltail sharks have likely declined substantially in the Brazil northern coast core range, but the agency finds that the magnitude of the decline impossible to quantify because studies use inconsistent methods, data are fishery dependent or anecdotal, and many regions lack systematic monitoring. This is a problem with much of conservation science today. When we look at environmental science, it kind of came out of engineering, and so many of the approaches have standard methods. And when I say standard methods, they are actually, this is the way we are going to do this. It's been peer reviewed. It is published in a journal, in a publication that's peer reviewed that states this is the accurate way to do. The way that you do it has been tested repeatedly to make sure it's viable. And if you are going to diverge from that method, you cite the method, and then you tell how you diverged it and justify that, which is often going to be something that you're going to have to do, because different organisms or different situations may require a tweak that's justifiable. This improves replicability, and it also ensures consistency from investigator to investigator. Whereas in conservation, it's kind of much more open, and that creates situations like this that when it goes to a legal setting can give the impression that the approach is not consistent. In the environmental sciences, like in ecotoxicology, they have had to take these and have these standardized methods that are very, very defined, because they frequently end up in court cases. Unfortunately, conservation, even though there are often court cases, the vast majority do not go to court. The vast majority are dealt with at an agency level, and so you don't have there has not been the urgency to have a standardized method. They do have books and so forth that claim to be standard methods, but they aren't really standard methods. They're really just methods. Like, how do I put up a drift fence, or how do I use a seine or whatever, but they don't actually have, this is the standard length for drift fence's wing, or this is the amount of time that you should spend, or things that there isn't a time-place dynamic that is standardized, and a technique standardization, nor is there training on those things beyond what it's very different. And it is because in conservation you may deal with such a huge array of species that it's very difficult to standardize. So it's not like just laziness or something, it's just the reality of the situation. But this does create problems when it goes to court. And so this kind of a decision could have been simply that the people who were in the policy-making arena, who were very potentially just lawyers, may have looked at it and said, well, this is all over the place. Where they wouldn't have said that specific thing if there was a very standardized method. So, having said that, the decisive policy choice is how the agency handles uncertainty. It treats uncertainty as a reason not to list rather than a reason for precautionary protection, and that is a huge failure. A huge failure. Uncertainty. A person who is going to walk into a room with no light in it, and they know there may be a hole in the floor, is going to very cautiously take the next step so they don't fall and die. Well, the same approach, in my opinion, with endangered species, and in the opinion of a lot of people, would be that if you allow the species to go extinct, it's gone. If you err in the other direction and it turns out you didn't need it, well, you can make up for that in some other way. Okay, providing that you don't have politicians who are just simply cutting, slashing, and burning budgets left and right, and so forth. So when we look at the Democratic and Republican viewpoints in the political context of this decision, I didn't find a notice-specific statement by named local, state, or national politicians about this exact small-tail shark finding. The political context, therefore, is drawn from the broader statements of the Endangered Species Act implementation, NOAA and National Marine Fisheries Authority, fisheries regulation, and the current administration's Endangered Species Act regulatory changes. Of course, I guess what it is when you're a legislator, it's incumbent upon you to be providing oversight to executive action, and the Federal Register is where those actions are communicated, and you're supposed to be monitoring it or have people under you monitoring it, and you are supposed to be making some form of a view on what this is, or talking to your constituency about what they think about the decision. If you aren't, then you aren't doing your job. And a lot of our politicians are very, very attuned to going around and pointing fingers at people who are supposedly not doing their job, while they are busy on TV picking up royalties for books they didn't write, getting on TV programs and getting visitor fees for talks and everything else, and grandstanding and pretending that they're actually doing something when all they're on is a big vacation to pocket more of their salary from the Congress. Heck, a lot of them don't even show up. We're all familiar with a particular person who hasn't been in there for quite a while. So, and I'm not picking on one party or another again, or any independents, since nobody has made any voice on this one either. And I've gone over many of these now, and it seems to be a trend. I might get one or two, but usually you're going to tell me no representatives in the region where this species exists have any care one way or the other? I would think they should. So, I'm digressing. As my master's advisor used to say all the time when he'd go off the deep end in some other direction. Okay, so Democratic and conservation aligned position on this issue would most likely be that the Democratic leaders on natural resources issues, including the House Natural Resources Ranking Member Jared Huffman, have repeatedly criticized the Trump administration Endangered Species Act changes as weakening the law and reducing protections for imperiled wildlife and habitat. And that view is not invalid. In the marine context, Huffman has also criticized proposals to reduce NOAA, National Marine Fisheries, capacity to transfer marine endangered species responsibilities, framing such actions as threats to the science-based marine conservation. Applied to the smalltail shark notice, this viewpoint would likely argue that the National Marine Fisheries Service is allowing uncertainty and weak foreign enforcement to prevent precautionary Endangered Species Act protection for the species with evidence of severe decline. The Republican and the current administration's aligned position would generally says that Republican critics of the Endangered Species Act expansion, including Senator Ted Cruz and the House Natural Resources Republicans, have argued that threatened species regulation should be tailored, economically realistic, and limited to the statutory regulations rather than the use of broad regulatory dragnet. The idea of economically realistic is just baloney. Okay, economics are always considered in all conservation and environmental decision making. They like this particular angle is continuously tossed out there so that people who aren't well informed because they're not in this field will believe that, oh, they're just trying to spend money willy-nilly. And that is not the case. It's baloney. It's political posturing to make you believe what they want you to believe. It's nuts. Now, the other issues, those are fine. Those are things that you can argue one way or another, and generally neither side is completely right or wrong on these. They are value statements, and some type of compromise between the two will still result in very strong conservation actions. But when either side just goes willy-nilly in their own direction and does whatever without consideration of the bigger picture, we end up with bad results. That's just the way it is. Okay? Okay. Applied to this notice, that viewpoint would likely support National Marine Fisheries Service for not listing a species when the agency says the best available data are too conflicting and uncertain to show that it is threatened or endangered. The smalltail shark case, therefore, sits in the middle of a larger ideological divide. One side emphasizes precaution, extinction risk, declining shark populations, and weak enforcement in the species core range. The other emphasizes legal thresholds, data quality, regulatory restraint, and avoiding Endangered Species Act listings when the record is uncertain or when the existing fisheries measure might be adequate if enforced. From a scholarly perspective, the scientific case for listing or stronger protection begins with the broader conservation status of sharks and rays. Dulvey and colleagues' global assessment of the chondrichthyans found that roughly 1/4 of shark, ray, and chimera species were threatened with overfishing, both targeted and incidental as a primary driver. Further, calculations that have been published in Biodiversity and Conservation have demonstrated that this particular group of of vertebrates are going extinct faster than they ever have at any other time in the planet. And that includes each of the underlying groups, the sharks and the rays and the chimeras, in the chondrichthy line. This broad pattern strongly supports concern for small coastal sharks caught as bycatch in poorly monitored fisheries. And also, if you don't do anything because you're afraid, because you think that they might not be going extinct, if you're wrong, they go extinct. If you do something and you're wrong, you're out a little bit of effort. And you aren't out billions and billions of dollars either. Okay? For the small-tailed shark specifically, the National Marine Fisheries summarizes evidence that the species has declined in Brazil, especially in Brazil northern coast region, which may be the historical core population. The notice discusses studies reporting fishers' observations of sharp declines, market evidence of illegal fin seizures, and demographic modeling that predicts very large declines under some assumptions. The National Marine Fisheries Service also agrees that overutilization and inadequate enforcement are the primary concerns for the species. Another argument for the protection is that the data deficiency is itself a risk multiplier. Fisheries-dependent records, misidentification with sharp-nosed sharks, lack of systematic monitoring, and weak enforcement can obscure the true decline. The marine conservation absence of robust data is often not evidence of absence of risk, but instead reflects the exact monitoring failure that allows cryptic declines to proceed. And many of our species that have gone extinct or are on the verge of extinction had a long history of cryptic declines, meaning that nobody was looking, so they didn't see it, when we knew that there were things going on that could cause them to go extinct. The strongest argument supporting the National Marine Fisheries Service is that the endangered species listing must be grounded in the best available scientific and commercial data, not generalized concern. The notice documents the substantial uncertainty in abundance, trend magnitude, stock structure, and demographic patterns. Some studies indicate serious decline, others are geographically limited, old, methodologically inconsistent, or contradicted by continued market presence. The National Marine Fisheries Service also emphasizes that the species may be more resilient than many sharks. It is smaller bodied, relatively broad ranging, opportunistic in diet, associated with multiple nurseries, and appears to mature earlier and produce larger broods than many high-risk shark species. If those life history estimates are accurate, and the species may recover from bycatch, faster than slower growing, late maturing sharks. Simply, it has a shorter generation time. However, having a shorter generation time doesn't mean that you're not at risk of extinction. In fact, we have had the Mormon locust out of Idaho that used to have enormous locust plagues across the entire northern North American continent. It went extinct after a few years of plowing, and it was an annual species. So, I mean, this, and it was a lot less in danger of extinction at the beginning. So, that isn't in of itself an explanation or an excuse. Okay. The greatest ecological and conservation implications are probably in Brazil and the North and northern South America, where the species appears more common, where bycatch and illegal harvest remain concerns, and where monitoring and enforcement appear weaker. The decision may reduce international pressure for stronger conservation actions because the U.S. Endangered Species Act listing often signals risk and can shape trade, diplomacy, and market attention, even for primarily foreign species. Species similar in appearance, and especially sharp-nosed sharks, are also indirectly affected because the petition requested ESA treatment for similar-looking species. The National Marine Fisheries Service declined similar in appearance treatment because it did not list the small-tailed shark. The identification issue remains biologically and enforcement relevant, but does not become a new endangered species regulatory category. The notice is socio-ecological because it continues a coastal predator, artisanal, and commercial fisheries, international wildlife trade, because it connects, it's socio-ecological because it connects coastal predator, artisanal, and commercial fisheries, international wildlife trade, data limited governance, enforcement capacity, local livelihoods, and federal conservation law. The small-tailed shark is not simply a biological object. It exists in a linked system of fish markets, gill nets, long lines, trawl, bycatch, international fin trade, coastal communities, and uneven national enforcement capacity. The key socio-ecological tension is that many of the strongest threats appear outside direct U.S. jurisdiction. The U.S. Endangered Species Act listing might raise the species profile and constrain some trade and federal actions, but it would not be by itself solve bycatch in Brazil, Venezuela, Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, or Mexico. Conversely, declining to list leaves the species dependent on the very fisheries controls and enforcement systems that the National Marine Fisheries acknowledges may be inadequate. From a governance standpoint, this is an example of how uncertainty is allocated. National Marine Fisheries Service allocated uncertainty against listing. A precautionary approach would allocate uncertainty towards temporary protection while data are improved. The decision affects who bears the risk: regulated trade and fisheries sectors, or the species and ecosystems if decline is worse than the available data show. From a biodiversity perspective, the decision is potentially negative if the small-tailed shark is actually declining more severely than the data reveal. It is neutral to positive if the National Marine Fisheries Service is correct and the species retains enough distribution, productivity, and resilience to avoid threatened or endangered status. From a fisheries and coastal economies perspective, the short-term regulatory burden is reduced because no endangered species regulations are created. The U.S. fisheries are likely minimally affected either way because the species is rare in U.S. waters and already prohibited in relevant U.S. shark management context. The international trade and enforcement perspective, the decision avoids new endangered species trade consequences, but leaves the species dependent on CITES, national shark laws, RFMO measures, and local enforcement. The National Marine Fisheries Service acknowledges continued non-compliance evidence, including fins and markets and shark stockpiles. From a science and monitoring perspective, the case highlights the major gap in data-limited marine fisheries governance. The decision may reduce urgency to fill data gaps, although the status review itself provides a foundation for future monitoring and research. It also highlights the fact that we don't have truly standardized methods in conservation at all, and that creates uncertainty for people who want to use that as an excuse not to expand protections. From an environmental justice and livelihoods perspective, remember that environmental justice is simply the process that protects everyday people from the rich and powerful. Here, artisanal fishing communities may avoid new U.S.-driven market constraints, but long-term resource depletion can also harm those communities if shark populations decline and fishery productivity shifts. We've seen this in other places where there were no protections and the particular wildlife or fishery that was being harvested ended up collapsing, and then the entire economy is damaged by the absence of that economic driver. From a litigation risk perspective, because the decision follows a lawsuit and settlement over delayed agency action, further litigation is plausible, especially over how the National Marine Fisheries Service weighed uncertainty, significant portion of its range, Brazilian declines, and adequacy of foreign regulation mechanisms. Overall, this is an important Endangered Species Act decision because the National Marine Fisheries Service acknowledges real warning signs, substantial decline in Brazil, bycatch, illegal harvest, inadequate enforcement, and limited data, yet decides those signs do not meet Endangered Species Act thresholds for threatened and endangered status. Now, they may or may not, because I haven't looked at the data. The decision is therefore less declaration that the small-tailed shark is safe than a declaration that the available record is too uncertain and contradictory to justify listing. For a review, overall, the National Marine Fisheries Service has a legally coherent rationale, but a biologically risky outcome. If the species resilience is real and the enforcement improves, the not warranted finding may be defensible. If the reported Brazilian declines and illegal trade evidence are closer to the true signal, this decision could delay needed protection until the species is much harder to recover and possibly even beyond help. That'll be it for this video. Be sure to review the beginning and so you can get the contact information if you would like to contribute comments about the decision to the National Marine Fisheries Service Southeastern Office. Have a nice day.